The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Texas plains as Thunder Horse guided his painted stallion toward the small homestead nestled in the valley below. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his dark eyes held the weight of a promise made 3 summers ago. The Comanche warrior had traveled 200 miles to collect what was rightfully his, and nothing would stand in his way. The debt was simple enough. Samuel Morrison, a struggling rancher, had borrowed horses from Thunder Horse's band during the harsh winter of 1847. The agreement was clear. If Morrison could not repay with cattle by the end of 3 years, he would forfeit his land and everything on it. Thunder Horse had been patient, perhaps more patient than his tribal brothers would have been, but patience had its limits. As he rode closer to the Morrison homestead, Thunder Horse noticed the signs of neglect that spoke of harder times. The fence posts leaned at odd angles, patched with whatever wood could be found. The barn roof sagged under missing shingles, and weeds had overtaken what should have been vegetable gardens. Still, smoke rose from the chimney, indicating life within the modest wooden house. Thunder Horse dismounted near the front porch, his moccasined feet silent on the hard-packed earth. He had learned English from traders and missionaries, though he preferred the flowing words of his native tongue. Today, however, he would need the white man's language to conduct his business. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman who seemed far too young to be Samuel Morrison's wife. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and her blue eyes held a wariness that spoke of recent hardships. She clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders, and Thunder Horse could see the trembling in her hands that she tried so hard to hide. "Mrs. Morrison," Thunder Horse said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Thunder Horse of the Comanche. I have come for Samuel Morrison." The woman's face paled, but she lifted her chin with surprising defiance. Samuel died last winter. Fever took him." Her voice cracked slightly on the words, revealing grief still fresh despite the months that had passed. Thunder Horse studied her face, searching for deception but finding only raw honesty and barely contained fear. This complicated matters, but it did not change the fundamental truth of the debt owed. "You are his widow," Thunder Horse stated rather than asked. "The debt passes to you. 3 years ago, your husband took 12 horses from my people. He promised cattle or land in return. The time has come." Sarah Morrison, for that was indeed her name, stepped back instinctively, but something in her eyes shifted from fear to fierce protectiveness. "There are no cattle," she said, her voice stronger now. "The drought killed them all last summer. Samuel sold what little remained just to buy food for the children." Thunder Horse's expression remained impassive, though inwardly he felt a flicker of something that might have been respect for this woman's courage. Many grown men cowered when faced with a Comanche warrior, yet this widow stood her ground despite her obvious terror. "Then the land is mine," Thunder Horse declared, his tone matter of fact. "You will gather your belongings and leave before the sun sets." It was then that Thunder Horse heard them. Soft voices from within the house, the unmistakable sound of children. His sharp ears caught fragments of conversation. A boy asking his mother who was at the door, a younger voice complaining of hunger. The warrior's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah Morrison seemed to sense his attention had been caught by the sounds from within. Her protective instincts flared, and she moved slightly to block his view of the doorway. "Please," she said, and the word seemed to cost her greatly. Thunder Horse suspected this woman was not accustomed to begging. "Give me time. I can work. I can find a way to repay what Samuel owed. The children have nowhere else to go." Thunder Horse had dealt with many debtors over the years. Some had tried to cheat him, others had attempted to fight, and a few had simply run away in the night. But none had ever appealed to him on behalf of children. The concept of deliberately orphaning young ones sat uneasily with him, though he could not say why. How many children? He found himself asking, though he had not intended to inquire. 3? Sarah replied quickly, hope flickering in her eyes at his question. "Tommy is 8, Mary is 6, and little Benjamin just turned 4 last month." Thunder Horse considered this information. In Comanche culture, children were precious, protected by the entire tribe. The idea of casting them out to starve was foreign to his understanding of honor. Even if they were white children. "Show me the debt papers," Thunder Horse commanded, buying himself time to think. Sarah disappeared into the house and returned moments later with a worn piece of paper, its edges frayed from handling. Thunderhorse examined the document, noting his own mark beside Samuel Morrison's shaky signature. Everything was in order, legal by both white and Indian standards. As he studied the paper, 3 small faces appeared in the doorway behind their mother. The oldest, a boy with his father's brown hair, stared at Thunderhorse with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The girl, red-haired like her mother, clung to her brother's shirt. The youngest, barely more than a baby, sucked his thumb and regarded the strange visitor with wide eyes. Thunderhorse had seen hunger before, in his own people during harsh winters, in enemy tribes after failed hunts. These children bore the telltale signs, the hollow cheeks, the clothes that hung too loosely, the way they moved as if conserving energy. Yet their mother had somehow managed to keep them clean and their hair neatly combed, maintaining dignity in the face of poverty. The warrior folded the debt paper and tucked it into his leather vest. "I will stay the night," he announced, noting how Sarah Morrison's shoulders sagged with what might have been relief or resignation. "Tomorrow we will discuss terms." Thunderhorse turned toward his horse, unsaddling the animal with practiced efficiency. As he worked, he could feel the eyes of the family upon him, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He wondered the same thing himself, for this was not the simple debt collection he had expected. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thunderhorse made camp near the barn, building a small fire as darkness approached. From the house came the sounds of a family settling in for the night, and the warrior found himself listening to the soft murmur of a mother's voice reading to her children. It had been a long time since Thunderhorse had heard such peaceful domestic sounds. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Morrison homestead, and Thunderhorse was already awake, sitting cross-legged beside the dying embers of his fire. He had slept little, his mind troubled by thoughts that had no place in a simple debt collection. The sounds from the house suggested the family was stirring. Hushed voices, the scrape of chairs, the careful movements of people trying not to wake others. Sarah Morrison emerged from the house carrying a bucket, heading toward the well. She moved quietly, but Thunderhorse's trained senses caught every step. He watched as she drew water, noting how she favored her right shoulder and the way she paused to catch her breath after lifting the heavy bucket. This woman was working far beyond her strength, yet she never complained. When she noticed him watching, Sarah straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that must have plagued her through the sleepless night. Thunderhorse nodded in acknowledgement. "Your children wake early," he observed, having heard the soft stirring from within the house. "They help with the chores," Sarah replied, lifting her chin with quiet pride. "Tommy tends the chickens and Mary helps with the washing. Even Benjamin tries to help, though mostly he just gets in the way." A small smile touched her lips at the mention of her youngest, revealing a glimpse of the woman she might have been in happier circumstances. Thunderhorse stood, his movement fluid and silent. "I would see your land," he announced. "All of it. You will show me." Sarah set down the water bucket and called toward the house. "Tommy, watch your brother and sister. I'll be back shortly." Then she turned to Thunderhorse, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Very well, but I should warn you there isn't much to see." They walked first to the barn, where Thunderhorse examined the structure with the eye of someone who understood the value of good shelter. The building was sound despite its weathered appearance, and he noted the careful repairs that had been made with whatever materials were available. Inside, a single milk cow lowed softly, along with a handful of chickens and an old plow horse that had seen better days. "Samuel built this barn himself," Sarah said, running her hand along one of the support beams. "Took him 2 summers, working evenings after the other chores were done. He was proud of it." Thunderhorse examined the craftsmanship, noting the careful joints and solid foundation. Samuel Morrison might have been a poor businessman, but he had been a skilled carpenter. "The wood is good," Thunderhorse admitted grudgingly. They continued to the fields where the remnants of last year's crops lay brown and brittle under the morning sun. Sarah pointed out the various plots, where corn had grown, where they had tried to raise wheat, where Samuel had planned to expand before the drought came. "The soil is rich when there's water," Sarah explained, kneeling to scoop up a handful of dark earth. "Samuel always said this land could support a fine farm if a man could just get ahead of the weather." Thunderhorse watched her crumble the soil between her fingers. noting how she spoke of her dead husband's dreams as if they were still possible. There was something admirable about this refusal to surrender hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As they walked, Thunderhorse began to test the widow in ways she might not recognize. He deliberately took longer strides, forcing her to hurry to keep up, but she never complained or asked him to slow down. When they came to a fence that needed mending, he stopped and waited to see what she would do. Sarah immediately began discussing the needed repairs, showing him the weak posts and explaining her plans to fix them when she could afford new wire. "You would do this work yourself?" Thunderhorse asked, genuinely curious. "I've learned to do many things I never thought possible," Sarah replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "When your children depend on you, you find strength you didn't know you had." They returned to the house to find the children gathered on the front porch, watching anxiously for their mother's return. Tommy stood protectively in front of his younger siblings, and Thunderhorse noted the boy's steady gaze and squared shoulders. Here was another who would not easily surrender. "Mama, are we leaving?" Mary asked, her voice small and frightened. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, smoothing the child's red hair. "Not today, sweetheart. Mr. Thunderhorse and I are still talking." Thunderhorse found himself studying the children more closely. The boy, Tommy, met his gaze without flinching, though fear was evident in his young eyes. The girl stayed close to her mother, but watched Thunderhorse with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a potential threat. The youngest, Benjamin, seemed less aware of the danger, more interested in the colorful beads that decorated Thunderhorse's vest. "They are hungry," Thunderhorse observed bluntly. Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she did not deny it. "We make do with what we have," she said quietly. "When did they last eat meat?" Thunderhorse pressed. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah's jaw tightened, and for a moment Thunderhorse thought she might refuse to answer. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 weeks ago, I traded some of my wedding china to the Hendersons for a chicken." Thunderhorse felt something twist in his chest at this admission. He had suspected the family's dire circumstances, but hearing it confirmed so starkly affected him more than he had expected. These children were slowly starving, and their mother was selling her most precious possessions to keep them alive for just a few more days. "You have no family?" Thunderhorse asked. "No one who could help?" Sarah shook her head. "Samuel and I came from back east. My parents died of cholera during the journey west, and his family disowned him for marrying an orphan girl. We had each other, and that seemed like enough at the time." Thunderhorse walked to his horse and retrieved a leather pouch from his saddlebags. Inside were strips of dried buffalo meat and some parched corn. He approached the children, noting how their eyes widened at the sight of the food. "Eat," he commanded, offering the pouch to Tommy. The boy looked to his mother for permission. Sarah hesitated for a long moment, her pride warring with her children's needs. Finally she nodded, and Tommy carefully took a small piece of the dried meat. "Share with your sisters," the boy said immediately, breaking the meat into smaller portions. Thunderhorse watched this display of selflessness with growing interest. These children had been taught values that transcended their current circumstances. Despite their hunger, they thought first of each other. As the children ate, Thunderhorse continued his evaluation of the widow Morrison. He posed seemingly casual questions about the land, the climate, the neighbors. Sarah answered thoughtfully, revealing a deeper understanding of farming and survival than he had initially suspected. She was not simply a helpless woman left destitute by circumstances. She was an intelligent person trapped by forces beyond her control. "The debt must be paid," Thunderhorse said finally, watching Sarah's face carefully for her reaction. "I understand," Sarah replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "But please, I'm asking for time. Give me 1 season to prove I can make this land productive. If I fail, I'll surrender everything without argument." Thunderhorse considered her proposal. It was not unreasonable, though it would require him to trust this white woman's word. In his experience, such trust was often misplaced. "And if you succeed in growing crops, how would you pay what is owed?" he asked. Sarah had clearly given this considerable thought. "The land itself is worth more than 12 horses. I could deed you a portion of it, keeping just enough to support my family. Or I could work for you, tending horses or helping with other tasks." The suggestion that she might work for him was intriguing. Thunderhorse had observed her determination and intelligence throughout the morning. and he was beginning to think this woman might be more valuable as an ally than as a debtor to be dispossessed. "You would work for a Comanche?" Thunderhorse asked, his tone skeptical. "I would work for anyone who treated my children fairly," Sarah replied without hesitation. Thunderhorse walked to the edge of the porch, his back to the family as he considered his options. Behind him, he could hear Sarah quietly instructing her children to finish the food he had given them. The sun was climbing higher, and he knew that his decision here would affect not only this family's fate but his own standing among his people. When he turned back to face them, Thunderhorse's expression was unreadable. "We will discuss this further," he said simply. "But first, there are things that must be done." Thunderhorse spent the afternoon observing the Morrison family's daily routine, and what he witnessed both surprised and impressed him. Despite their poverty and uncertain future, the household operated with remarkable efficiency and discipline. Sarah had created structure where chaos might have reigned, and her children responded to her guidance with respect and cooperation that spoke well of their upbringing. Tommy, the 8-year-old, demonstrated responsibility far beyond his years. He fed the chickens with careful attention to ensuring each bird received its share, checked the eggs with gentle hands, and spoke to the animals with the kind voice of someone who understood their dependence on human care. When one of the chickens appeared listless, Tommy brought it to his mother's attention immediately. "This one's been acting poorly for 2 days," the boy reported, cradling the bird with practiced ease. "I think she might be getting sick." Sarah examined the chicken with knowledgeable hands, checking its eyes and feeling its crop. "You're right, Tommy. We'll need to separate her from the others so she doesn't spread whatever she has." She looked up at Thunderhorse, who had been watching this exchange with interest. "Samuel taught me about caring for livestock. He said a sick animal could ruin an entire flock if you weren't careful." Thunderhorse nodded approvingly. This showed wisdom that many experienced farmers lacked. He had seen entire herds destroyed because someone failed to recognize and isolate disease early enough. Mary, despite being only 6, proved herself capable of tasks that would challenge older children. She helped her mother hang laundry on the line, standing on a wooden crate to reach the rope and handling the wet clothes with careful attention to avoid dropping them in the dirt. When little Benjamin wandered too close to the well, Mary immediately guided him away from danger without being asked. "Benjamin, come help me sort the buttons," Mary called to her youngest brother, successfully diverting his attention from potential mischief. She had arranged a collection of mismatched buttons on a blanket, turning the mundane task of organization into a game that kept the toddler occupied, and learning Thunderhorse found himself particularly intrigued by the way Sarah managed her children's education despite their circumstances. Throughout the day, she posed questions that encouraged them to think and observe. When Tommy wondered why the sick chicken was behaving differently, Sarah guided him through the process of identifying symptoms rather than simply providing answers. When Mary struggled with counting the buttons, her mother patiently showed her different ways to group them to make the task easier. "Mama, why don't we have books like the Henderson children?" Benjamin asked during one of their impromptu lessons. Sarah's face tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "We have stories in our heads, sweetheart. Sometimes those are the best kind because we can change them however we like." Thunderhorse watched as Sarah began telling her children a tale about brave pioneers who overcame impossible odds through cleverness and determination. The story was clearly improvised, but it held the children's attention completely and subtly reinforced values of courage, resourcefulness, and family loyalty. This woman was not simply surviving. She was actively shaping her children's character and preparing them for the challenges they would face. As the day progressed, Thunderhorse began to implement his own quiet tests of the family's character. When Benjamin dropped his piece of dried buffalo meat in the dirt, Thunderhorse waited to see what would happen. The little boy looked at the soiled food with obvious disappointment, but before he could cry, Tommy knelt beside him. "It's okay, Benjamin. We can brush it off and it'll be fine," the older brother said gently, demonstrating how to clean the meat and offering half of his own portion to supplement what his brother had lost. Later, when Mary found a small coin that had apparently fallen from Thunderhorse's pouch, she brought it to him immediately rather than keeping it or even telling her mother first. "Is this yours?" she asked, holding out the copper piece with both hands. Thunderhorse took the coin and studied the little girl's earnest face. "Why did you not keep it?" he asked. Mary looked puzzled by the question. Because it's not mine, she replied simply. These were not the responses Thunderhorse had expected from children living in desperate poverty. Most people, especially hungry children, would have been tempted to keep found money or food. The Morrison children had been taught principles that transcended their immediate needs. As evening approached, Thunderhorse made his decision about how to proceed. He approached Sarah as she prepared their meager dinner, noting how she managed to make their small portion of cornmeal stretch by adding wild greens she had gathered and seasoning it with herbs from her struggling garden. Your children are well trained, Thunderhorse observed, his tone carefully neutral. Sarah paused in her stirring, unsure whether this was praise or criticism. They're good children, she replied cautiously. They understand that we must all work together to survive. Their father taught them these ways? Thunderhorse inquired. Samuel and I both did, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of something close to her heart. We wanted them to grow up knowing right from wrong regardless of our circumstances. Being poor doesn't mean being without honor. Thunderhorse nodded slowly. This aligned with his own beliefs about child rearing, though he was surprised to find such principles in a white family. In my tribe, he said carefully, children who show such discipline and respect are greatly valued. They become the leaders of the next generation. Sarah looked up at him, trying to read his expression. Your people are fortunate to have such children, she said diplomatically. As are you, Thunderhorse replied, and this time his tone carried unmistakable respect. Thunderhorse walked to his horse and retrieved another item from his saddlebags, a small pouch of salt, precious as gold on the frontier. He returned to where Sarah was cooking and held it out to her. Your food lacks flavor, he said simply. Sarah stared at the offering, understanding the value of what he was providing. Salt could preserve meat, enhance nutrition, and make even the plainest meal more palatable. It was not something to be given lightly. I cannot repay this kindness, Sarah said quietly. It is not given for repayment, Thunderhorse replied. It is given because children should not eat flavorless food. As Sarah added the precious salt to their dinner, Thunderhorse continued his evaluation. Tell me about your husband's debt, he said. Not the numbers on the paper, but how it came to be. Sarah set down her wooden spoon and faced him directly. The winter of '47 was the worst anyone could remember. We lost most of our cattle to the cold, and the surviving animals were too weak to work. Samuel was desperate to plant crops that spring because we had no other way to feed the children. She paused, her eyes distant with memory. Your people came through in early March with horses to trade. Samuel knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew that without those horses to help with plowing and planting, we would all starve. He thought 3 years would be enough time to build the farm back up and pay what was owed. But the drought came, Thunderhorse said, understanding the chain of misfortune that had led to this moment. 2 summers in a row, Sarah confirmed, and then Samuel got sick last winter. By the time the fever broke, he was too weak to recover. Her voice remained steady, but Thunderhorse could see the effort it cost her to speak of her husband's death. Thunderhorse considered this story. It matched what he had observed of the family's character and explained much about their current situation. Samuel Morrison had not been trying to cheat anyone. He had been a desperate man making a risky decision to save his family. The plan might have worked under different circumstances. Your husband was not dishonest, Thunderhorse concluded. No, Sarah agreed firmly. Samuel was many things, stubborn, proud, sometimes foolish, but he was never dishonest. If he had lived, he would have found a way to pay what was owed, even if it took longer than 3 years. Thunderhorse walked to the edge of the porch again, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Tomorrow he would need to make his final decision about the debt and this family's fate. But tonight he found himself wondering if there might be a solution that could serve everyone's interests. When he turned back to the family, Thunderhorse's expression had softened almost imperceptibly. Tonight we eat together, he announced. Tomorrow we will speak of the future. The shared meal that evening proved to be unlike anything Thunderhorse had expected when he began his journey to collect Samuel Morrison's debt. Sarah had managed to transform their simple cornmeal and vegetables into something approaching a feast, with the addition of his salt and some wild onions the children had gathered. More surprising still was the conversation that flowed around the modest table. Tommy, emboldened by his mother's example of treating their intimidating guest with cautious respect, began asking Thunderhorse questions about his horse and his travels. The boy's genuine curiosity about Comanche horsemanship revealed an intelligence that impressed the warrior, who found himself explaining techniques for reading animal behavior and understanding the land. "How do you know which way to go when there are no roads?" Tommy asked, his eyes bright with interest. Thunderhorse gestured toward the darkening sky. "The stars never lie," he said simply. "And the land speaks to those who know how to listen. The way water flows, how the grass grows, where the animals make their paths, all of these things tell a story of direction." Mary, not to be outdone by her brother, shyly asked about the beadwork on Thunderhorse's vest. When he explained that his sister had made it, and that each pattern told part of his family's history, the little girl listened with the rapt attention of someone discovering magic. Even little Benjamin contributed to the conversation in his innocent way, offering Thunderhorse bites of his food and chattering about the chickens and how he helped gather eggs. The toddler showed no fear of their imposing guest, instead treating him like an interesting new uncle who might have stories to tell. But it was Sarah who truly surprised Thunderhorse with her depth of knowledge and understanding. As they talked, she revealed familiarity with Comanche customs that went far beyond what most white settlers possessed. She asked respectful questions about his tribe's way of life and listened to his answers with genuine interest rather than judgment. "Samuel and I always believed that understanding our neighbors was important for survival out here," Sarah explained when Thunderhorse commented on her knowledge. "We traded with several Indian families over the years, and they taught us much about reading weather patterns and finding water during dry spells." Thunderhorse found this attitude refreshing. Too many white settlers viewed his people as either noble savages or dangerous enemies, never bothering to see them as individuals with rich cultures and practical wisdom. Sarah Morrison seemed to understand that survival on the frontier required cooperation rather than conflict. As the evening progressed, Thunderhorse began to share more of his own story. He spoke of his childhood, learning to ride before he could properly walk, and his training as a warrior and hunter. He described the beauty of his homeland and the challenges his people faced as white settlement expanded westward. "Do you have children of your own?" Sarah asked gently, sensing something in his tone when he spoke of teaching young riders. Thunderhorse's expression grew distant. "I had a son," he said quietly. "Brave Eagle. He died 3 winters ago fighting soldiers who came to drive us from our hunting grounds." The table fell silent at this revelation. Sarah reached across and briefly touched Thunderhorse's hand, a gesture of sympathy that surprised them both with its spontaneity and sincerity. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply. "No parent should have to bury their child." Thunderhorse looked at her hand on his, noting the calluses and scars that spoke of hard work and sacrifice. This woman understood grief and loss in ways that transcended the differences between their peoples. "He was brave," Thunderhorse said finally. "He died protecting those he loved." "Then he died with honor," Sarah replied, withdrawing her hand but maintaining eye contact. "That's all any of us can hope for." After the children had been put to bed, Thunderhorse and Sarah sat on the front porch, discussing the practical realities of their situation. The night air was cool, and stars were beginning to appear in the clear sky. "I have been thinking about your proposal," Thunderhorse said, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "You ask for 1 season to prove this land can be productive." Sarah nodded, trying to keep hope from showing too obviously in her expression. "I know it's a risk for you to trust me, but I believe this farm can succeed with proper attention and adequate rainfall." Thunderhorse studied her face in the moonlight. "What makes you believe this when your husband could not make it succeed?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had her answer ready. "Samuel was a good man, but he tried to do everything himself. He was too proud to ask for help when he needed it, and too stubborn to change his methods when they weren't working." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've learned from his mistakes. I know which crops grow best in this soil, and I've been talking with other farmers about new techniques for conserving water." "And you would accept help if it were offered?" Thunderhorse asked pointedly. "I would accept any honest help that didn't compromise my children's safety or well-being," Sarah replied without hesitation. Thunderhorse rose from his chair and walked to the edge of the porch, his silhouette dark against the starlit sky. I will make you an offer, he said finally, turning back to face her. But it is not the offer you have requested. Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. I'm listening. You ask for 1 season to prove yourself as a farmer, Thunderhorse continued. But I have seen enough to know you are more valuable than that. You understand animals, you know the land, and you raise children who have honor. These are rare qualities. Sarah waited, unsure where this was leading, but sensing that her family's fate hung on his next words. My proposal is this, Thunderhorse said, his tone formal, as if announcing a decision of great importance. You will keep your land, but you will also manage horses for my people. We have need of someone who can care for animals and deal fairly with white traders. Your children will learn both white and Comanche ways, preparing them for a world where both peoples must learn to live together. Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You would trust me with your horses? I would trust you with more than horses, Thunderhorse replied. I would trust you to be a bridge between our peoples when suspicion and hatred seem easier than understanding. The weight of what he was proposing began to settle over Sarah. This was not just a business arrangement. It was a complete transformation of her family's future. What would this mean exactly? She asked, needing to understand the full scope of his offer. Thunderhorse returned to his chair, leaning forward as he outlined his vision. You would remain here on your land, but you would also maintain a horse herd for my band. We would provide the initial animals and supplies you need to succeed. In return, you would care for the horses, train young animals, and serve as a trading post for honest dealings between Indians and whites. He paused, gauging her reaction before continuing. Your children would learn to ride as Comanche children do, and they would learn our language and customs. But they would also continue their white education, making them valuable to both peoples. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of his offer. It was far more generous than anything she had dared hope for, but it also carried responsibilities and risks she hadn't considered. Why? She asked simply. Why would you do this for us? Thunderhorse was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the star-filled sky. Because my son died believing that whites and Indians could never live in peace, he said finally. I want to prove him wrong. And because your children deserve a chance to grow up in a world where their honor and strength matter more than the color of their skin. Sarah felt tears threatening but kept them at bay. This is more than generous, but I need to understand what you expect from me. What happens if I fail? What happens if other whites or other Indians disapprove of this arrangement? If you fail honestly, you keep your land and we find another solution, Thunderhorse replied. As for disapproval, that is a risk we both face. Change always frightens those who benefit from the old ways. Sarah stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the land that had been her family's hope, and nearly their doom. The moonlight illuminated the fields where her husband had dreamed of prosperity, and where she now envisioned a different kind of future. I accept your offer, she said, turning back to face Thunderhorse. But I want to be clear about one thing. I will never ask my children to choose between being white or Indian. They will be both or they will be neither, as they decide for themselves. Thunderhorse nodded approvingly. That is exactly what I hoped you would say. 3 months after Thunderhorse's unexpected offer, the Morrison homestead had transformed into something neither Sarah nor her late husband could have imagined. Where once stood empty corrals and failing crops, now thrived a bustling operation that served as both horse ranch and cultural meeting ground. Thunderhorse had kept his word in every detail. The first herd of horses arrived 2 weeks after their agreement, led by his nephew Running Wolf and accompanied by an elderly Comanche woman named Singing Bird, whose knowledge of horse medicine proved invaluable. Sarah watched in amazement as the animals settled into their new home, their presence bringing life and purpose back to the land Samuel had struggled to tame. The children adapted to their new circumstances with the remarkable resilience of youth. Tommy threw himself into learning horsemanship with the dedication of someone who had found his true calling. Under Running Wolf's patient instruction, the boy progressed from nervous observer to confident rider in a matter of weeks. Watch how he moves with the horse, Running Wolf explained to Sarah as they observed Tommy practicing in the main corral. Your son has natural balance. In our tribe, such riders become great hunters and warriors. Mary discovered her own talents in the gentler arts of horse care. She showed exceptional skill at recognizing the early signs of illness or injury in the animals, often alerting the adults to problems before they became serious. Singing Bird took particular interest in teaching the little girl about herbal remedies and traditional healing methods. "This child has the sight," Singing Bird told Sarah one afternoon as they watched Mary carefully examine a mare's injured hoof. "She sees what others miss. It is a gift that should be nurtured." Even little Benjamin found his place in the new order, becoming an unofficial mascot for the entire operation. The Comanche visitors treated him with gentle humor, teaching him words in their language and showing him how to approach the horses safely. His fearless nature and cheerful disposition made him a favorite among both the Indian and white traders, who began frequenting the ranch. Sarah herself discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. The business aspects of horse trading came naturally to her, and she found she had an intuitive understanding of which animals would suit particular buyers. More importantly, she began to serve as a mediator between two worlds that too often viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. "Mrs. Morrison has fair scales and an honest tongue," declared Jake Henderson, a neighboring rancher who had initially disapproved of the arrangement. "Can't say I understand all this Indian business, but she's never steered me wrong on horseflesh." The success of the venture brought unexpected challenges as well as rewards. Word of the unusual partnership spread throughout the territory, attracting both curiosity and criticism from various quarters. Some white settlers viewed Sarah's cooperation with the Comanche as a betrayal of her own race, while certain Indian factions questioned Thunder Horse's wisdom in trusting white people with valuable animals. The first serious test of their alliance came when a group of buffalo soldiers arrived at the ranch, led by a stern cavalry officer who clearly disapproved of what he saw. Captain William Hayes had heard reports of suspicious activity at the Morrison place and had come to investigate. "Mrs. Morrison," the captain said, removing his hat but maintaining a formal demeanor, "I need to ask you some questions about your business arrangements here." Sarah had been expecting such a visit and had prepared her responses carefully. She invited the soldiers to dismount and offered them water, maintaining the hospitality that frontier customs demanded while being careful not to appear either guilty or defiant. "Certainly, Captain," she replied calmly. "What would you like to know?" "We've heard reports that you're harboring hostile Indians and possibly trading weapons," Captain Hayes stated bluntly. Tommy, who had been working with one of the horses nearby, moved closer to his mother, his young face showing both fear and determination. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder while addressing the officer's concerns. "The only Indians who visit here are Thunder Horse's people, and they come to tend their horses, not to plan raids," Sarah explained patiently. "As for weapons, we trade horses, saddles, and supplies for legitimate ranching purposes. I keep detailed records of all transactions if you'd like to examine them." Captain Hayes spent the better part of the afternoon investigating the ranch, questioning Sarah, examining the horses, and reviewing her meticulously kept ledgers. Thunder Horse himself arrived during the inspection, having been alerted by scouts of the soldiers' presence. The meeting between Thunder Horse and Captain Hayes was tense, but professional. Both men recognized the other as a formidable opponent, and both understood that the wrong word could escalate into violence that would destroy everything Sarah had worked to build. "I know your reputation, Thunder Horse," Captain Hayes said carefully. "You're considered a man of honor among your people, as you are among yours," Thunder Horse replied with equal formality. "We have no quarrel with the army, provided they do not interfere with legitimate business." The captain studied the Comanche leader thoughtfully. "Mrs. Morrison speaks highly of your agreement here. She says it's helping to keep peace in the territory." "Peace benefits all people," Thunder Horse observed. "War brings only suffering and death." After extensive investigation, Captain Hayes found no evidence of illegal activity. More importantly, he began to understand the value of what Sarah and Thunder Horse had created. The ranch served as a neutral ground where conflicts could be resolved through negotiation rather than violence. "I'll be keeping an eye on things here," the captain warned as he prepared to leave. "But I have to admit, Mrs. Morrison, you seem to be doing something right. We've had fewer incidents in this area since your operation began." As the soldiers rode away, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and pride. They had passed their first official test, but she knew it wouldn't be their last. Building trust between hostile groups required constant vigilance and endless patience. The challenges weren't limited to official interference. Sarah also had to navigate the complex social dynamics of her new role. Some of the Comanche women initially viewed her with suspicion, questioning whether a white woman could truly understand their ways. Similarly, several white families in the area stopped associating with the Morrisons entirely, considering Sarah's alliance with Indians to be scandalous. But for every relationship that became strained, new friendships developed. Sarah found herself serving as confidant and advisor to people from both cultures who appreciated her unique perspective and honest counsel. Young Comanche men sought her advice about dealing with white traders, while white ranchers asked her to negotiate with Indian horse dealers. "You have become what my grandmother would call a bridge walker," Singing Bird told Sarah one evening as they worked together preparing medicine for a sick foal. "You help others cross from one world to another." The description resonated with Sarah, who had begun to see her role in exactly those terms. She was helping to create something new, a space where different peoples could meet as equals, where children could learn from multiple traditions, and where cooperation proved more profitable than conflict. As autumn approached, Thunderhorse announced that he would be bringing tribal elders to inspect their partnership and decide whether it should continue or expand. Sarah felt nervous about this evaluation, knowing that the future of her family and the ranch depended on impressing people whose values and expectations she was still learning to understand. "Do not worry about pleasing them," Thunderhorse advised when Sarah expressed her concerns. "Be yourself as you have always been. The elders value authenticity above all else." Sarah spent weeks preparing for the visit, ensuring that every aspect of the operation ran smoothly, and that her children understood the importance of making a good impression. But as the day approached, she realized that she had already received the most important endorsement possible: Thunderhorse's continued trust and the growing prosperity of their shared venture. 2 years had passed since Thunderhorse first arrived to collect Samuel Morrison's debt, and the autumn of 1850 brought with it a sense of completion and new beginnings. The ranch that had once teetered on the edge of failure now stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people chose cooperation over conflict. The Comanche elders' visit the previous year had exceeded Sarah's most optimistic expectations. Old Chief Iron Bear, Thunderhorse's grandfather and the most respected leader of their band, had spent 3 days observing the operation and speaking with everyone involved. His final pronouncement had surprised even Thunderhorse with its enthusiasm. "This woman understands the true nature of wealth," Iron Bear had declared. "She knows that prosperity comes not from taking from others but from creating something that benefits all people." The elders' endorsement had opened doors throughout the territory. Other Indian bands began seeking Sarah's services as a mediator and trader, while white settlers who had initially been suspicious gradually came to appreciate the stability and prosperity her operation brought to the region. Tommy, now 10 years old, had grown into a skilled horseman whose reputation was spreading among both cultures. His ability to gentle wild horses using techniques that blended white and Comanche methods made him valuable to ranchers throughout Texas. More importantly, his ease in moving between two worlds made him a natural ambassador for the kind of understanding his mother and Thunderhorse were trying to build. "That boy has the gift," observed James Patterson, a gruff cattle rancher who had initially opposed Sarah's partnership with the Comanche. "Doesn't matter if he's talking to a stubborn Bronco or a stubborn Indian. He knows how to make them listen." Mary, at 8, had developed into Singing Bird's most promising apprentice in the arts of animal healing and herbal medicine. Her gentle touch and intuitive understanding of horse behavior made her invaluable to the operation. But her greater gift lay in her ability to see past surface differences to the common humanity beneath. "She will be a great healer," Singing Bird predicted, watching Mary carefully tend to a mare who was having difficulty with her pregnancy. "But more than that, she will heal the hatred between peoples." Little Benjamin, now 6 and full of boundless energy, had become a living symbol of the cultural bridge his family represented. Equally comfortable speaking English or Comanche, equally at home in the saddle or in the schoolhouse, he embodied the possibility of a future where such divisions mattered less than character and capability. The success of their venture had attracted attention far beyond the immediate territory. Government officials had begun citing the Morrison Ranch as an example of how peaceful coexistence between Indians and whites might be achieved. Newspaper articles had been written about the remarkable widow who taught Comanche warriors the value of honest trade. But Sarah remained focused on the daily realities of building and maintaining the relationships that made their success possible. She had learned that trust was earned in small moments rather than grand gestures, and that lasting peace required constant attention to fairness and mutual respect. Thunderhorse had become more than a business partner. He had become family in ways that transcended formal relationships. His presence at the ranch was as natural as the sunrise, and his guidance had shaped not only the children's understanding of horses, but their understanding of honor and responsibility. "You have given my children something I never could," Sarah told him one evening as they watched Tommy demonstrate a new riding technique to a group of young Comanche visitors. "You've shown them that courage and wisdom exist in many forms." Thunderhorse nodded thoughtfully. "And you have shown my people that honor and generosity are not limited to any one race. Your children prove that the best of both worlds can live in the same heart." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a dusty rider bearing news that would test everything they had built together. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to Sarah despite the shared name, brought word that tensions were rising between the Army and several Comanche bands over recent raids attributed to rogue warriors. "Mrs. Morrison," the lieutenant said after dismounting and accepting the offered water, "Captain Hayes sent me to warn you that there may be trouble coming. Some of the tribal bands are talking about war, and there are whites calling for military action against all Indians." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. They had managed to maintain their peaceful island in an ocean of suspicion for 2 years, but she had always known that larger forces might eventually threaten what they had built. Thunderhorse's expression remained calm, but Sarah could see the tension in his posture. "What have you heard specifically?" he asked the soldier. "Raids on settlements to the north," the lieutenant replied. "Cattle stolen, buildings burned, one family killed. The raiders left Comanche arrows, but some folks are saying all Comanche should be held responsible." Thunderhorse's jaw tightened. He knew, as did Sarah, that such raids were often the work of young warriors acting without tribal approval, or sometimes even the actions of other tribes trying to deflect blame. But in times of tension, such distinctions were often ignored in favor of collective punishment. "What does Captain Hayes recommend?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He suggests you might want to distance yourself from your Indian partnerships until things settle down," the lieutenant said diplomatically, "for your own safety and that of your children." Sarah looked at Thunderhorse, seeing her own determination reflected in his dark eyes. They had worked too hard and come too far to abandon their mission at the first sign of trouble. "Lieutenant," Sarah said firmly, "please tell Captain Hayes that I appreciate his concern, but I have no intention of abandoning my business partners or my principles because other people choose violence over reason." Thunderhorse spoke up as well. "And tell him that my people will continue to honor our agreements, regardless of what others may do." After the soldier departed, Sarah and Thunderhorse spent long hours discussing how to protect what they had built, while potentially helping to defuse the larger crisis. Their ranch had proven that cooperation was possible. Perhaps it could also demonstrate how conflicts might be resolved without warfare. The solution they devised was both simple and dangerous. They would organize a gathering of tribal leaders and government officials at the ranch, creating a neutral space where grievances could be aired and solutions negotiated. It was risky. Bringing together people who viewed each other as enemies required careful preparation and considerable courage. The gathering took place 3 weeks later, with representatives from 5 different Comanche bands, 3 Army officers, 2 Texas Rangers, and several local ranchers in attendance. Sarah's house had never hosted such a diverse or potentially volatile group. She opened the meeting by sharing the story of how her partnership with Thunderhorse had begun, with a debt that could have been collected through force but was instead transformed into an opportunity for mutual benefit. She spoke of what her children had learned from both cultures and what the community had gained from peaceful trade. 2 years ago, I was a widow with hungry children, facing the loss of everything my husband had worked to build, Sarah told the assembled group. Today my children are healthy and educated, My land is prosperous and our community is stronger. This happened not because we ignored our differences, but because we chose to build something together despite those differences. The discussions that followed were sometimes heated, often difficult but ultimately productive. Grievances were aired on both sides, misunderstandings were clarified, and agreements were reached that helped diffuse the immediate crisis. Not every participant left completely satisfied, but all left with a better understanding of the other side's perspective. As the last visitors departed, Sarah surveyed her home with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. Furniture had been rearranged to accommodate the crowd, and the kitchen still bore evidence of the massive meal she had prepared for dozens of people from different cultures, with different dietary customs. "Do you think it will make a difference?" she asked Thunderhorse as they began restoring order to the house. "Time will tell," he replied thoughtfully. "But today people who might have met only in battle instead sat at the same table and shared food. That is how peace begins. One meal, one conversation, one moment of understanding at a time." 3 months later, Sarah received a letter from the territorial governor, commending her efforts to promote peaceful relations and requesting her advice on Indian policy. Similar recognition came from tribal councils, newspaper editors, and fellow ranchers who had witnessed the transformation of their region. But the recognition that meant the most came from her children, who had grown up believing that people of different cultures could work together, learn from each other, and build something better than either could achieve alone. As Christmas approached, Sarah stood on her front porch watching Tommy teach a group of mixed Indian and white children how to train young horses using the techniques he had learned from both traditions. Mary was nearby brewing medicines with Singing Bird, while discussing the symptoms of winter ailments in 2 languages. Benjamin raced around the yard with his friends, their laughter transcending any cultural boundaries. Thunderhorse joined her on the porch, and together they watched the scene that represented everything they had worked to achieve. "Your husband's debt has been paid," Thunderhorse said quietly. Sarah smiled, understanding that he meant far more than the original 12 horses. "Yes," she agreed, and with interest that neither of us expected. The debt that had begun as a potential tragedy had become the foundation for something unprecedented, a legacy of understanding that would shape the next generation and echo through the years to come. In choosing cooperation over conflict, Sarah Morrison and Thunderhorse had proven that even the deepest divisions could be bridged by people willing to see beyond their differences to their common humanity.